Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is the show where we try to get to grips with some of the big ideas that shape our theological understanding.
And you're tuned into the deep dive. We basically take a whole load of sources, notes, research.
And try to boil it all down into something digestible, maybe some insights that get you thinking.
Yeah, the goal is really to cut through some of the noise, give you a good, solid grasp of topics that really matter without you needing to read stacks of books yourself.
And today we are definitely doing a deep dive into, well, one of the weightiest theological discussions you can find.
Yeah.
Jonathan Edwards and his doctrine of original sin.
Mm-hmm. We'll be looking at how he built his case, how he argued for it.
And also, which is fascinating, how he tangled with his main critics, specifically Dr. Taylor of Norwich and Dr. Turnbull.
Right. The goal today really is to unpack Edwards' defense.
Understand what the disagreements were actually about with those critics.
And see why Edwards thought this doctrine was so absolutely central to getting the good news of salvation.
So yeah, get ready for some hopefully compelling points and maybe even a few surprises about how Edwards viewed humanity's natural condition. Let's get into it.
It's quite something, how Edwards structured his work on original sin. It's not just him stating his views in isolation.
No, it feels more like a direct response, doesn't it? A kind of running debate with specific books and ideas that were out there at the time.
Exactly. He clearly saw this not as some, abstract theological game.
Right, but as something vital, foundational for Christian belief.
For him, the stakes were incredibly high. This wasn't optional.
Okay, so if it wasn't just about winning an argument, why was this specific doctrine, original sin, so important for Edwards? What was he really trying to defend?
Well, looking at the big picture, Edwards believed that understanding original sin properly reveals humanity's, and he uses this phrase, state of total ruin.
Total ruin. That's a strong language.
It is, and he means it comprehensively. It's not just, we sometimes make mistakes or have bad inclinations. No, for Edwards, it involved two things. Deep inherent moral corruption within us.
Okay.
And also our exposure to terrible outcomes, consequences we actually deserve because of that corruption.
So a deserved outcome.
A just outcome, he'd argue, of moral evil. And without seeing that clearly, the whole idea of the great salvation by Christ, the gospel itself, well, it loses its context.
It's like you said before we started, offering a cure when someone doesn't even know they're sick.
Precisely that. It's like being handed an antidote, maybe a life-saving one, but you had no idea you'd ingested poison. For Edwards, the gospel message rests entirely on this foundation. To really grasp God's good news, you first have to accept this initial, pretty grim picture of the human condition.
It's the diagnosis that makes the cure make sense.
And makes it absolutely essential.
Yeah.
If you downplay the problem, you inevitably misunderstand the solution, its scale, its necessity.
Okay, that really clarifies the urgency he felt. So when Edwards uses the term original sin, what exactly did he mean? Can you break down the components he was focused on?
Sure. Edwards, and he was drawing on how theologians commonly use the term then, identified two main aspects. Both were critical for him.
Okay, what's the first?
The first, and maybe the one people think of most often, is the innate sinful depravity of the heart.
Innate depravity.
Yeah, meaning a natural, built-in evil disposition, a moral corruption that's part of human nature from birth.
So not something we learn or pick up, but something inherent.
Exactly. It's our default setting, you could say. A tendency towards sin that affects our thoughts, desires, actions right from the start.
Okay, that's the first part. What's the second?
The second aspect is what's called the imputation of Adam's first sin.
Imputation, meaning?
Meaning that Adam's descendants, that's us, are exposed in God's fair judgment to share in the consequences of Adam's original disobedience in the garden.
So we're held liable, in a way, for the results of what Adam did.
That's the idea. It's about a just liability stemming from that initial act of rebellion, often understood in terms of Adam acting as our representative, our federal head.
Right, so it's both things. An inner corruption and this kind of legal or judicial liability. That's a key pairing.
It is.
But that second part, the imputation, that sounds like the bit that would really draw fire, especially the idea of it being just. How did Edwards handle that, particularly when his opponents were arguing against it based on God's justice?
That's a really good question. And yeah, Edwards knew that was a sticking point. He spent a lot of effort on it.
So how did he connect the two, the inner depravity and the outer liability?
Well, he saw them as deeply linked. He didn't think you could really separate them cleanly. He argued they were so closely joined that proving one actually helped to establish the other.
How so?
His thinking went something like this. If it's true that all humans are born with this innate sinful depravity,
Okay.
this corruption that universally leads us into sin and ruin, then that widespread inherent condition must have a cause, a reason that can be justly traced back.
And for him, that cause was Adam's sin.
Exactly. It wasn't just that we suffer the fallout from Adam's sin, like inheriting a debt. It was deeper. In God's righteous judgment, we're considered implicated in it, or at least justly subject to its consequences because of our connection to Adam.
So the inner corruption we experience is, in a sense, the outworking of that original imputed guilt.
That's how Edwards saw it. They're like two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
Our fallen condition involves both the legal standing and the resulting internal corruption. He argued that the very fact of universal depravity is evidence that something foundational happened at the beginning that legally involved us all.
Okay, so Edwards wasn't just writing theological thoughts in his study. He was actively engaging in a debate, almost like stepping into a ring.
Definitely.
And who are the main figures in the other corner challenging this view?
He primarily locked horns with two significant writers of his day who were pushing back hard against the traditional doctrine of original sin.
Who were they?
Dr. Turnbull, and the one who got most of Edwards' attention, Dr. Taylor of Norwich. Edwards mentions reading such of the more noted opposers, and these two were clearly top of his list for a detailed response.
He wasn't just picking off easy targets then.
No. These were serious contemporary thinkers. He aimed to dismantle their entire opposing framework, not just poke holes in it.
And you mentioned Dr. Taylor was central. How deep did Edwards' engagement with Taylor actually go? Was it just a few footnotes or?
Oh, much, much more than footnotes.
Yeah.
Edwards explicitly calls Taylor the author chiefly attended to in his whole work on the subject.
Chiefly attended to.
Yeah, and he describes Taylor as a late and specious writer. Specious is interesting, suggesting Taylor's arguments might look good on the surface, but were ultimately misleading. Edwards states very clearly that he closely attended to Dr. Taylor's piece on original sin in all its parts. His goal was that no one thing there said of any consequence in this controversy should pass unnoticed.
Wow, that's thorough. He read everything Taylor wrote on it.
It seems so. Not just Taylor's main book, The Scripture Doctrine of Original Sin Proposed to Free and Candid Examination, but also Edwards says he looked at many things in that other book, containing his key and exposition on Romans.
So a really focused, sustained effort against Taylor's arguments.
Absolutely. He wasn't aiming for a quick rebuttal. He wanted a comprehensive, systematic takedown of Taylor's position on this doctrine.
Okay, this really gets us to the core of the disagreement then. What was it at bottom that Taylor and Turnbull just wouldn't accept about human nature? What did they fundamentally object to?
Their main point of contention, the thing they strenuously denied, was the idea that the heart of man is naturally of a corrupt and evil disposition.
So they rejected inherent, built-in moral corruption from birth.
Flat out rejected it. And along with that, they opposed the idea that Adam's sin resulted in a corrupt nature being passed down to his descendants.
They thought we started differently.
Yeah, they believed we were born essentially neutral or maybe even with a natural inclination towards good, not inherently bent towards evil.
So, if they denied this widespread corruption, what did they propose instead? What was their picture of humanity's basic state?
Well, instead of corruption, they basically argued that good preponderates and that virtue has the ascendant in the world.
Good outweighs the bad, generally speaking.
That was their view. They looked at society and felt that, on balance, there was more morality and kindness than vice and wickedness. Dr. Turnbull used an interesting analogy.
Oh, yeah.
He said, look, you don't judge the overall health of a population by only looking inside a hospital, right?
Makes sense.
Or you don't judge the general morality of society by only looking at criminals in court. He argued that the number of honest citizens and farmers far surpasses that of all sorts of criminals.
So the bad stuff is the exception, not the rule.
That was his point. He even suggested that criminals themselves probably do more innocent and kind actions in their day-to-day lives than actual crimes. Serious wrongdoing, for Turnbull, was relatively uncommon. That's why it stood out and got recorded.
Okay, that's Turnbull's analogy. Did Taylor have a similar one? Warning against judging the whole by its worst elements.
He did. Very similar logic. Taylor said, quote, "We must not take the measure of our health and enjoyments from a lazar house."
A what now?
A lazar house, like a hospital for lepers or contagious diseases.
Mm-hmm.
Nor of our understanding from Bedlam.
The famous asylum.
Right. Nor of our morals from a jail. His point was the same. Judging humanity based on these extreme negative examples gives you a distorted picture.
It doesn't represent the average person.
Exactly. He believed those places showed aberrations, not the true general state of human nature, which he thought was fundamentally capable of good, not inherently depraved. Both were essentially saying, look at the big picture, humanity's basically okay.
So Edwards is facing this fundamentally more optimistic view of human potential. How did he try to approach understanding human nature to counter that? How did he define this disposition or tendency he talked about?
Edwards's method was to look at outcomes. He argued we understand a disposition or tendency by seeing what happens constantly or generally in event.
So look at the results.
Yeah, especially if you see the same result happening over and over across a great variety of circumstances, and even when there are strong efforts used to the contrary that still don't manage to prevent it.
Like trying to stop water running downhill. If it always does, that tells you something about gravity and slopes.
That's a good analogy. If you consistently see a certain outcome, despite different environments, different teaching, different attempts to stop it, then that outcome isn't just chance or circumstance. It points to some underlying prior inclination or disposition.
So applied to morality.
Applied to morality, Edwards argued, if humanity consistently, universally shows widespread moral failure, not just isolated bad acts, but a universal pattern of sinning despite laws, education, conscience, societal pressure, all trying to prevent it.
Then that pattern reveals an inherent prior corrupt leaning within us.
Exactly. That constant general failure, for Edwards, was the proof of a corrupt disposition of the heart. The outcome reveals the nature.
Now, Edwards makes this really crucial distinction, which you mentioned earlier, about considering human nature without divine grace. That feels key, but maybe easily missed. Why was isolating that natural state so vital for his whole case?
It really is the linchpin, and you're right, it's often where the disagreement lay. He insisted that the true tendency of the innate disposition of man's heart has to be considered as they are in themselves or in their own nature without the interposition of divine grace.
So strip away God's help and see what's left.
Pretty much. To assess our natural state, you have to conceptually remove God's active, benevolent intervention. An inherent tendency is evil and pernicious, he argued, if its own nature leads to extremely pernicious consequences and utter ruin.
Even if God steps in later.
Even if God, out of free mercy and kindness, later intervenes to stop that outcome from actually happening to everyone. The point isn't what ultimately happens to every individual because of grace. It's about what would happen if things were just left to run their natural course, without any divine rescue mission.
So grace is like an external force, not part of the original system.
That's exactly how Edwards framed it. Divine grace is a sovereign intervention. It's totally separate from our natural state. It's the remedy, the countermeasure. It doesn't change the disease itself, our inherent nature. It just reverses the course of things, as he put it, preventing the natural disastrous endpoint.
So even if grace prevents, say, eternal ruin for some, the underlying tendency towards it and the fact that we deserve it naturally, that remains. That's not canceled out.
That's precisely his point. And he clarifies this further with this idea of a moral tendency or influence by desert.
By desert, meaning what we deserve.
Yes. When he talks about moral depravity, he's looking at what our nature deserves. Let's use an analogy. Imagine someone commits treason. They legally deserve the death penalty. Now, the head of state issues a full pardon out of sheer mercy.
Okay.
The crime was still real, the deserving of the penalty was still just, even though the final consequence was mercifully averted. Edwards says our natural state is like that. We are justly liable to ruin, not because God actively makes us bad, but because of what we are and what we deserve in our fallen nature apart from grace.
So the deserving remains, even if mercy is shown.
Yes. Grace testifies to God's goodness, not to our original innocence or lack of desert.
This really clarifies that debate around God's justice, because Edwards' opponents would say it's unjust for God to consider us corrupt or liable because of Adam. How did Edwards flip that around, especially since he also relies heavily on God's justice?
His counter was essentially to distinguish between what God's grace does and what God's justice would permit or require if grace wasn't involved. He famously said the controversy is not what grace will do, but what justice might do.
What justice might do.
His point was, if our natural exposure to ruin is indeed in a way of justice, meaning we justly deserve it, then the very need for divine grace proves the point.
How so?
Well, if we weren't justly deserving of ruin to begin with, then justice alone would be sufficient. We wouldn't need grace to save us from a just outcome. He accused Dr. Taylor of confusing the issue by looking at humanity's state after grace has intervened and then drawing conclusions about the original state being somehow okay or rectified.
Taylor thought grace fixed an unjust system.
Edwards felt Taylor implied that, suggesting grace was like a compensation or correction for a basically unfair, foregoing constitution. Edwards pushed back hard. Grace isn't making up for God being unfair earlier.
It's not compensation.
No, it's sovereign favor shown to those who justly deserve the opposite. The very fact that grace is necessary for Edwards demonstrates that our natural condition, apart from it, is one that justly warrants destruction.
That's a really subtle but critical distinction he's making. Okay, so given all that, what was Edwards's core claim, his main proposition about humanity's natural state that he set out to prove?
His central assertion, the thing he aimed to demonstrate, was this, and it's quite stark. Mankind are all naturally in such a state, as is attended, without fail, with this consequence or issue, that they universally run themselves into that which is, in effect, their own utter eternal perdition, as being finally accursed of God and the subjects of his remediless wrath through sin.
Wow. So inevitably heading for utter eternal perdition under God's wrath because of sin. That's blunt.
It is, and he believed he could prove this by establishing two key things, two pillars for his argument.
What were the two pillars?
First, that all mankind, universally, without exception, commits sin.
Okay, universal sinfulness. Pillar 1.
Second, that all sin, even the smallest, justly deserves and exposes the sinner to utter and eternal destruction.
Okay, sin deserves eternal ruin. Pillar 2.
If he could establish both of those firmly, then his conclusion that our nature must be inherently corrupt and headed for ruin would follow logically, in his view.
All right, let's look at that first pillar then, the universal commission of sin. How did Edwards make the case for that? What evidence did he pull out?
He marshaled a really wide range of scriptural evidence. He wasn't just picking isolated verses. He was showing a consistent theme running through the Bible.
Like what?
Well, think of Solomon's prayer in 1 Kings 8.46, stating plainly, "There is no man that sinneth not." It's presented as a basic fact of human existence.
Pretty direct.
Or Ecclesiastes 7.20, which says almost the same thing. There is not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not. He also used Psalm 143.2, the plea, "In thy sight shall no man living be justified."
So Old Testament texts.
And New Testament too, heavily relying on the Apostle Paul. Romans 3.1920 is crucial, where Paul says the law exists so that every mouth may be stopped and all the world become guilty before God, and then concludes, "Therefore by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh be justified in his sight."
Basically, everyone is guilty. No one gets justified by works.
That's Paul's point, yeah. Edwards also pointed to Galatians 3, verse 10, saying, "As many as are of the works of the law are under the curse," and verse 22 saying, "The scripture hath concluded or shut up all under sin." Like we're all in prison together by sin. And then there's 1 John 1, verses 7 to 10, which talks about the need for all believers to confess sin, implying it's a universal issue, even for Christians.
So direct statements, but anything else?
Yeah. He also pointed to practices commanded in the Old Testament, like the universal requirement for sacrifices or the ransom money required for everyone counted in Israel in Exodus 30. Edwards saw these as symbolic recognitions of universal guilt and the need for atonement for everyone, not just a few bad apples.
Okay, that's a strong biblical case. Now, you mentioned something remarkable earlier, that Dr. Taylor, the main opponent, actually kind of conceded this point about universal sin. How did that happen?
Yeah, this is where Edwards' argument gets really interesting and, frankly, quite clever strategically. Taylor, even while arguing against inherited sin, made some statements that Edwards seized upon.
What did Taylor admit?
Well, Taylor acknowledged that God's standard is perfection. He said God can never require imperfect obedience or by his holy law allow us to be guilty of any one sin, how small soever.
So the standard is absolute perfection. Any slip-up is sin.
Exactly. And building on that, Taylor then explicitly stated, and Edwards quotes him, "No one of mankind from the beginning of the world can ever be justified by the law because everyone transgresses it."
Everyone transgresses it. Taylor said that.
He did. And then Taylor even asks rhetorically, for who, when, from the beginning of the world, could be saved? It's this crystal clear admission of universal failure to meet the law's standard, coming straight from the mouth of the guy arguing against original sin.
Wow. So Taylor basically handed Edwards the evidence for his first pillar.
Pretty much. Edwards highlighted this concession, effectively saying, look, even my main opponent agrees that absolutely everyone fails to keep God's perfect law. It was a major point for Edwards.
Okay, that's a huge concession. Now for the second pillar, that all sin justly deserves eternal destruction. How did Edwards argue for that? What's the standard for judgment here?
The standard for Edwards is God's moral law. He describes this law not as arbitrary rules, but as the reflection of God's own perfectly holy, just, and good nature. It's everlasting, unchangeable, rooted in everlasting truth and righteousness.
And its demands are?
Absolute.
Yeah.
It requires perfect obedience, and not just in outward actions. It reaches into the heart, condemning even lust and irregular desires, the minutest branches of sin. Nothing escapes it.
And the consequences for breaking it.
Because the law is so perfect and absolute, its condemning power is also absolute. Edwards points to Paul calling it the letter that kills, the ministration of death, and the ministration of condemnation in 2 Corinthians 3.
Strong terms.
Very. And the penalty prescribed by this law for every transgression, Edwards argues, is death. But he clarifies this isn't just physical death.
What then?
It's final perdition, the second death, eternal ruin. In essence, everlasting wrath and curse.
And Edwards argued that this severe penalty, eternal ruin for even a small sin, is actually just. That seems hard to grasp for many. How did he defend that?
He insisted it is just. He argued that this punishment, even for the least sin, is just and righteous, and perfectly agreeable to truth and the nature of things. God's justice, he said, weighs things in an even balance. It sees things as they truly are.
So the law reveals the true nature of sin.
Yes, it shows sin in its proper colors, revealing what it really is, an exceeding great and deadly evil. The reason even a seemingly small sin deserves such a massive punishment, in Edwards' view, comes down to who is being sinned against.
God himself.
Exactly. A sin against an infinite, perfectly holy God is an infinitely serious offense. The gravity isn't measured by the size of the act itself, but by the infinite majesty and holiness of the one offended. So for Edwards, eternal punishment isn't disproportionate, it's the just reflection of offending infinite goodness.
Okay, I see the logic. Now, the really surprising part again, did Dr. Taylor also concede this point about sin's just penalty? It seems like that would completely undermine his whole case against inherent ruin.
It's just as striking as his first concession, maybe even more so. Edwards points out that Taylor himself confesses and asserts that God's law justly threatens sin with death.
Justly threatens death.
Yes, and Taylor agreed that the law reveals the natural and proper demerit of sin. Demerit meaning what sin inherently deserves.
So Taylor agreed sin deserves death.
He did. Taylor affirmed that every sin is in strict justice deserving of wrath and punishment. And he even agreed that the death threatened by the law is eternal death, or final perdition.
That's astonishing.
It really is. Edwards quotes Taylor making incredibly strong statements like, "If we once transgress, we are ruined forever." That shows Taylor clearly understood the law's absolute condemning power.
Once transgress, ruined forever. Wow.
Taylor also acknowledged that without God's mercy, the situation for anyone under such a law must be quite deplorable. So you have this tension. Taylor denies inherited corruption. It admits that any actual sin, which he also admits is universal, justly deserves eternal ruin.
Edwards must have seen that tension as a huge opening.
Oh, absolutely. He basically used Taylor's own words about the law's justice and sin's desert to build his second pillar.
So with these two pillars seemingly established, even with Taylor's help, universal sin, and sin justly deserving eternal ruin, what does the law itself offer people? Any hope there?
According to Edwards, none whatsoever. The law, precisely because it's perfect and just, supplieth neither help nor hope to the sinner. It diagnoses the problem perfectly, reveals our utter failure, and pronounces the just sentence. It leaves humanity, as Edwards put it, under the power of sin and sentence of death. It's like a perfect mirror showing you your fatal flaw, and a judge delivering the inevitable verdict, but offering no way out.
Right, no escape route provided by the law itself.
None at all.
Which leads us directly then to the need for divine grace. How does Edwards introduce grace into this picture? How does it relate to this seemingly hopeless situation under the law?
Edwards presents grace as something completely external to this system of law and deserved consequence. He calls it something altogether independent on it, meaning independent of our natural tendency or what we deserve.
It comes from outside.
Yes, it's introduced to oppose the natural tendency and reverse the course of things. It's not a natural development or something earned. Its whole point is to save man from deserved ruin and to prevent the fatal consequence that our nature would otherwise lead to.
And this is the grace for pardon and salvation.
Exactly. The grace needed for pardon and salvation, the very thing Taylor admitted we all need to fly to his God's mercy for. precisely because no one can be justified by the law's standards.
So grace is God's sovereign, unearned rescue operation.
That's the idea. Not a correction of an unfair system, but a totally free act of favor, intervening in a system where condemnation was justly deserved. It's a whole new factor entering the equation.
And let's just circle back one more time to that crucial nuance because it seems so easy to misunderstand. Edwards insists grace doesn't change our inherent nature or what that nature deserves in itself, right?
Absolutely vital to restate that. He hammers this point.
Yeah.
The interposition of divine grace does not alter the nature of things as they are in themselves. Meaning grace doesn't magically make our natural state non-corrupt, nor does it make us retroactively undeserving of ruin. The true nature and tendency of humanity's state, which is one of justly deserving ruin that remains what it is, grace just steps in to prevent the deserved outcome.
Like the pardon analogy again.
Exactly. The pardon doesn't mean the crime doesn't happen or didn't deserve punishment. It just cancels the punishment. Grace prevents the consequence without denying the original demerit or the inherent depravity.
And the very fact that grace is needed is proof for Edwards.
Yes. He concludes that the necessity of grace itself shows that our liableness to misery and ruin comes in a way of justice. If we weren't justly ruined, if justice alone would see us safe, grace wouldn't be required. Grace is needed precisely because justice condemns us. It's God's free kindness stepping in where justice would otherwise have its due course.
Okay. So Edwards has built his case on these two pillars: universal sin, sin deserving eternal ruin, heavily supported, ironically, by his opponent. How does he bring it all together? What's the final unifying conclusion about original sin and the human condition?
His final conclusion flows directly from those two established pillars. He argues, if it's true that all mankind universally commits sin,
Killer one.
and if it's true that all sin justly deserves eternal destruction, then the logical consequence is that the natural state of the mind of man is attended with a propensity of nature which is prevalent and effectual to such an issue.
Meaning our nature reliably leads to this outcome.
And that therefore their nature is corrupt and depraved with a moral depravity, that amounts to and implies their utter undoing.
So the conclusion is innate ruinous corruption.
Yes. Put simply, our natural state without fail, attended without fail, he says, leads to utter eternal perdition, resulting in us being finally accursed of God and the subjects of his remediless wrath through sin. It's a chain of reasoning, universal outcome plus just consequence for the actions leading to it. It's an inherent flaw in the source.
And what are the implications of accepting this conclusion for Edwards? Why did he fight so hard for it? Why is it more than just a point of theology?
For Edwards, this wasn't just one doctrine among many. It was absolutely foundational. He believed that recognizing that all mankind are by nature in a state of total ruin changes everything.
Also,
it's the essential backdrop against which the gospel makes sense. This diagnosis of our natural state makes the great salvation by Christ not just helpful, not just a nice offer, but utterly essential. It's the only remedy to the disease.
without it, the gospel isn't really necessary.
Or at least its necessity isn't properly understood. All real understanding of the gospel for Edwards depends on grasping this first. If you don't see the depth of the problem, our natural state of ruin, and just condemnation, then you can't possibly appreciate the magnitude, the wonder, the sheer grace of God's saving work in Christ.
It makes Christ's work seem less significant if the problem isn't that bad.
Exactly. If we're not truly lost and justly ruined by nature, then Christ's sacrifice might seem like an overreaction, or maybe just one option among others. But for Edwards, acknowledging original sin is what allows us to see the grace of God in its true, breathtaking context.
Yeah.
It makes salvation truly amazing.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot today. Seeing how Edwards built his case for original sin, arguing that our natural state is inherently corrupt, leading inevitably to sin and justly deserving ruin.
And it really is striking how he used his opponent's own statements, particularly Taylor's concessions about God's perfect law and our universal failure, to strengthen his own points.
Yeah, a very skillful detail argument. It was a real intellectual undertaking.
Definitely.
You know, thinking about all this raises a further thought. If Edwards is right, if our natural state, apart from God's act of favor, really is one tending towards utter ruin, how should that change how we see grace in our everyday lives? Not just the grace that saves us eternally, but common grace.
That's an interesting angle.
Does it maybe push us to see the good things we experience, moments of kindness, maybe societal order, even just the fact that things aren't constantly falling apart, not as proof that we're inherently good, but as constant, quiet examples of God's kindness.
Like God actively holding back the full consequences of our fallenness.
Yeah, preventing deserved outcomes in countless small ways, day by day, even for people who don't acknowledge him at all. Maybe the goodness we see isn't evidence against depravity, but evidence of God's restraining, preserving grace.
That certainly puts a different spin on things. It makes you think about how much we might be spared, constantly, without even realizing it.
Something to consider, perhaps. How much is held back not by our merit, but by an unseen divine hand?
A sobering yet potentially gratitude-inducing thought.
Well, we hope this deep dive into Edwards' arguments has given you a clearer picture of this really foundational theological doctrine. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Until next time, keep considering.